Paris was supposed to save her, or at least that's what Meghan Markle told herself the moment the jet shuddered through the low autumn clouds and the first lights of the city flickered beneath her like a promise she was desperate to believe. Because Paris had always been the city where myths were reborn, where fallen muses found new worshippers and old stories were painted in fresher, brighter colors. But as she stepped out of the sleek black car that carried her to the Balenciaga showcase, she felt the first prick of dread. Not fear, not yet, but something cooler, sharper, like the city sniffed her intentions and found them wanting, and the cameras that usually snapped at the first hint of her silhouette seemed to hesitate, like they were waiting to see which version of Meghan had come to Paris. The survivor, the symbol, or the woman whose empire was beginning to shake beneath her own ambition. The night air was crisp, almost metallic, and each breath she took felt rehearsed. Each movement a step from choreography she had practiced so many times that she no longer remembered which parts belonged to her and which had been borrowed from 1,000 old photographs of Diana, or borrowed elegance from Hollywood icons she once studied in the quiet corners of her old apartment long before titles, crowns, and controversies carved new edges into her life. The photographers noticed everything: the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the tension in her jaw, the smile that trembled in the corners even though it was supposed to look serene, effortless, victorious. And while the flashes came, they came softer, scattered, as though even the lights were keeping their distance, unsure whether to embrace her or expose her. She felt the shift like a temperature drop, the invisible curtain that separated reverence from observation, and behind it, she sensed 1,000 eyes watching, assessing, deciding who she was now and whether she still mattered in this world where relevance evaporated faster than perfume on warm skin, and she forced her steps to appear graceful, telling herself that this was her rebirth, her fresh beginning, even as the city whispered a different story. Inside the Balenciaga venue, the air was thick with curated silence, the kind that hovered in elite rooms where power didn't speak loudly because it didn't have to, and Meghan felt it pressing against her skin, reminding her that she was no longer the phenomenon she once was, no longer the woman whose presence shifted conversations, influenced headlines, or sent social media into frenzy. She was a guest now, polite, tolerated, processed, but not revered, and the realization struck deeper than she wanted to admit. Marcus Anderson was somewhere behind her, his voice low, commanding, giving notes to her team with the precision of a director managing a nervous lead actress, and Meghan hated the flicker of dependence she felt. She needed him tonight far more than she wanted anyone to know. As assistants adjusted the draped white ensemble she wore, fabric that felt less like couture and more like armor she hoped could shield her from the whispers already curling through the room. She caught the reflection of herself in a mirror, and for the slightest, most fragile moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The eyes were hers, dark, alert, hungry, but the expression belonged to someone cornered by her own myth, someone fighting to hold together a story that was finally tearing at the seams. She blinked quickly and turned away before the doubt could root deeper. She needed to be magnetic tonight, undeniable, unshakable, because this appearance, this night, was supposed to become the opening chapter of her resurgence, the proof that she could rise again even after the world had grown colder toward her. But the room refused to play along. Editors didn't rise from their seats when she passed. Designers nodded courteously, but without warmth. Stylists exchanged glances that carried stories they wouldn't dare say aloud, and the air hummed with conversations she wasn't invited into. Meghan's smile held, tight and polished, but she felt every inch of the distance forming around her, the way her relevance had shifted from fascination to formality, from must-see to optional presence. When she finally took her seat, strategically placed but not honored, showcased but not spotlighted, she crossed her legs carefully, aware of every camera positioning, every angle she might be captured from, and she felt a rush of heat coil in her stomach as she sensed how different this moment was from the triumphant return she'd envisioned. Harry wasn't with her. He'd stayed behind under the pretense of obligations and security concerns, but the truth was heavier than the excuses. They needed space, distance, breathing room from the tension that had been growing between them like mold in a sealed room. Meghan lifted her chin as if the thought didn't sting, as if Harry's absence didn't magnify the isolation she now felt in this room filled with people who no longer believed in the story she had built around herself. Whispers drifted around her like smoke, soft, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore. Words she wasn't meant to hear but did. Why is she here? Who invited her? Is this a sponsorship or a stunt? She's trying too hard. She kept her expression still, serene, the way she'd practiced in the early days of royal life when every blink felt judged, but there was a hollowness forming behind her ribs, a quiet ache that pulsed each time someone looked past her instead of at her. And then came the moment she dreaded most, the reality she had hoped Paris would erase. When the models took the runway and cameras rose like a forest of metallic arms, she waited for the familiar shift where some of them would turn to capture her reaction, her presence. But this time they didn't. Not one lens swung her way. Not one flash redirected to her face. She wasn't the story tonight, and the realization was a cold slap that made her breath falter for half a second. She forced her body to remain perfectly poised, but inside, she felt the floor tilt. Backstage, the rumors were already spreading before the show ended. Her glam team, tense and hyper-focused, tried to maintain the illusion of control, powdering her face, smoothing fabric, whispering instructions, but they felt the tremor beneath their own professionalism. Meghan's perfume, heavy and floral, hung thick in the corridor like a nervous cloud, and someone quietly joked, too close to her not to be overheard, that the scent wasn't confidence, but panic bottled up and sprayed on generously. The makeup artist dabbed at her foundation, muttering about coverage over exhaustion, not sparkle, while an assistant adjusted the hem of her outfit that had begun to crease, insisting the light would hide everything even though both of them knew the truth. Nothing about tonight was hiding the fractures. Meghan overheard pieces of their conversations, snippets that weren't meant for her but cut anyway. This look wasn't designed for her. Borrowed. Last minute. They didn't prioritize her. She swallowed the humiliation like a hot coal, keeping the smile locked in place. As she stood waiting for a car after the show, the night pressed close, colder now, and the flashes that once chased her came intermittently, hesitantly, like the photographers were reminiscing rather than documenting. She stepped into the vehicle with a grace she didn't feel, her pulse beating a little too fast, her mind racing through the scenes of the night like a film she wished she could re-edit before anyone else saw it. But the worst was yet to come. The driver, following her team's pre-planned route to capture subtle moments for PR angles, entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the one place Meghan had never wanted to acknowledge but could never quite escape, the place where Diana's story ended and where Meghan's public myth had so often been compared. The car's interior lights glowed softly across her face, and for a second she lifted her phone, angling it for a shot, a moment she told herself was symbolic, meaningful, artistic. But as the car glided through the tunnel, a shiver crawled up her spine, because deep down she knew that no matter how she framed it, no matter how she edited or explained it later, the world would not see artistry. They would see imitation, provocation, manipulation. And for the first time that night, Meghan felt something deeper than embarrassment or tension. She felt fear, not of Paris, not of the cameras, but of the possibility that she no longer controlled the story unfolding around her. And that was the beginning of the unraveling. The moment the lights from the runway flashed like lightning behind the curtains, Meghan felt the entire room closing in, the heat wrapping around her like a net as voices clashed, rushed footsteps scraped against polished floors, and the rising scream of cameras outside made it impossible to think, yet she kept moving, shoulders tight, jaw locked, eyes darting to every corner as if the shadows themselves could expose her secrets, while Harry followed a step behind, unable to slow her, unable to calm her, watching the way her fingers trembled against the silk fabric of her dress, a tremble she tried to hide but failed to bury under her usual perfectly rehearsed calm. And as they pushed deeper into the backstage labyrinth, the air changed, colder, sharper, filled with whispers that carried her name in a tone that sliced through the atmosphere like a knife. Whispers from stylists she didn't know, photographers she didn't trust, influencers who pretended to smile but narrowed their eyes. The moment she passed, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last until she stopped abruptly, forcing Harry to nearly collide with her. But she didn't look back, didn't apologize. She only stared ahead at Marcus Anderson leaning against a marble pillar, arms crossed, expression unreadable, the neon blue lights behind him outlining his silhouette like a figure emerging from a nightmare she thought she'd buried years ago. He pushed off the wall slowly, no rush in his movements, as though he knew she could not escape. His eyes locked onto hers with a familiarity that tasted like danger and history, and Meghan's breath caught. Not because she feared him, but because she feared what he represented. The version of her she had tried so hard to erase. The version who had made choices she wanted sealed forever. Harry stiffened, instantly sensing the electricity sparking between them, the kind of tension that needed no words, and he stepped forward slightly, positioning himself half in front of her, subtle but protective, his voice low as he murmured, "We don't have time for this, Meg." But she didn't respond, couldn't respond, because Marcus tilted his head with that slow, knowing smile that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. The smile of someone who remembered everything. Every conversation. Every look, every promise, every threat. And he didn't need to say a word for her to know that he hadn't forgotten what happened in Toronto before the world knew her name. Before Meghan could speak, before Harry could drag her away, a sudden shout pierced through the noise. "Where's Meghan? The director needs her now." And the crowd erupted, crew members running like soldiers in chaos, pushing carts stacked with gowns, fixing earpieces, adjusting lights so bright they burned white streaks into her vision, and Meghan startled hard enough to step back, bumping into Harry's chest, who gently but firmly placed a hand on her shoulder as if anchoring her from the storm that kept trying to pull her under. But Marcus only chuckled under his breath, leaning closer, whispering low enough that only she could hear. "You can run all you want, but the truth always walks faster." And the words sliced through her composure so sharply she flinched, turning her face away, breathing through her teeth, forcing herself not to react because the last thing she needed was for Harry to see that Marcus still had the ability to shake her. Harry's eyes flicked between them, confusion tightening his expression, suspicion blooming slowly like a storm cloud forming in the distance. But before he could question anything, a handler rushed up to them, grabbing Meghan's wrist lightly, pulling her toward the staging corridor, breathless as she tried to speak over the thundering music vibrating through the walls. "You're on the list for the pre-show interview. They need you now. It's chaos out there. Please come quickly." And Meghan, desperate for any escape from Marcus's gaze, let the handler drag her forward, her heels echoing sharply like gunshots on the floor, while Harry followed close. But Marcus stayed where he was, watching her vanish into the maze of curtains and scaffolding with an expression that promised he wasn't done with her. The hallway narrowed into a tight passage lit by fluorescent lights that hummed like a warning, and Meghan felt her stomach twist as the noise from the main stage pulsed through the walls. Drums, bass, electronic beats like a racing heartbeat, and suddenly a camera swung in front of her, blinding her for a second. A reporter shouting questions she barely registered, flashes exploding against her eyes until everything blurred, and Harry cursed under his breath, stepping between her and the camera, shielding her, guiding her away with a hand on the small of her back. But Meghan couldn't focus on the chaos around her anymore. All she could hear was the echo of Marcus's voice repeating like a haunting refrain. The truth always walks faster, and the words dug into her, pulling up memories she had tried to bury. Late-night calls, whispered deals, favors exchanged in dim hotel bars, alliances she regretted, alliances she feared would ruin everything if exposed. She tried to steady her breath as Harry led her through another curtain into a quieter prep room where makeup artists whispered urgently and models paced nervously, the smell of hairspray and perfume hanging heavy in the air, and Harry turned her around gently, cupping her cheek, searching her face with worried eyes, murmuring, "Meg, what was that? What did he mean? Why did he look at you like?" But she cut him off quickly, too quickly, brushing past him to take a seat in front of the illuminated mirror, avoiding her own reflection because even she didn't want to see the panic flickering in her eyes, saying in a steady tone she did not feel, "He's just trying to get attention, Harry. You know people here, they love creating drama. Ignore him." But Harry didn't look convinced. He watched her closely, noticing the slight tremble in her hands as she adjusted her ring, the way she blinked too quickly, the way her shoulders tensed every time someone opened the door, as if expecting Marcus to appear again. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, voice low. "Meg, I've known you long enough to know when you're lying." And she froze, mascara wand shaking slightly in her grip. But before she could answer, a producer burst into the room, calling her name urgently, saying her interview spot was starting in 60 seconds and they needed her now, and Meghan exhaled shakily, grateful for the interruption, rising to her feet as if pulled by an invisible force, smoothing her dress, lifting her chin, slipping the mask of confidence back over her fear. And when she stepped out of the room into the blinding lights of the side stage, the noise of the crowd crashing over her like a tidal wave, she felt Harry's gaze burning into her back, full of questions she wasn't ready to answer, full of fears she wasn't ready to confirm. The interviewer stood waiting beneath a circle of harsh white spotlights, microphone raised, smile tight and rehearsed, and as Meghan stepped into the light, her breath hitched, not because of the cameras, not because of the pressure, but because she caught a glimpse of Marcus standing far behind the crowd, half in shadow, leaning casually against a lighting post as though he owned the room. His eyes locked onto her with that same expression that promised everything was about to unravel, and as the interviewer began speaking, "We are here with Meghan Markle." Meghan's heart dropped into her stomach because she knew with absolute certainty that tonight was no longer about fashion or interviews or image. Tonight was about secrets, shadows, and the past she hoped would never return. The moment Meghan stepped away from the interview circle and the lights dimmed behind her, her pulse finally began to slow, just for a second, before the noise of the backstage hall surged back around her, swallowing her in a whirlwind of shouts, rushing footsteps, and the thunderous bass pounding through the floors, and she clutched the edge of the curtain as though she needed to physically hold the world in place. But the trembling wouldn't stop because she could still feel Marcus's gaze on her, like a fingerprint burned into her spine. She didn't have to look to know he had moved again, drifting through the backstage corridors like a ghost who knew every exit and every secret passage, and Harry stayed a step behind her, watching her closely, his jaw tight, his breath short, his thoughts clearly spinning faster than he could catch them. But Meghan forced herself to stand straighter, wipe the nervous sweat from her palms, and pretend that nothing inside her was collapsing, though the cracks were already showing. A stylist passed by holding a shimmering gold gown and murmuring compliments to someone behind her, and a makeup artist rushed by clutching brushes as though running from a fire. But Meghan barely registered any of it. Her eyes kept darting to the left, to the right, to the shadows where Marcus had once stood, trying to figure out where he had gone and what he was planning. Because Marcus never appeared without purpose, never spoke without calculation. Whatever he was here for, it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't nostalgia. It was leverage. And leverage was the one thing she could not afford anyone to hold over her anymore. Harry finally stepped around her, gently taking her forearm, trying to pull her into a quieter corner near a cluster of mannequins draped in velvet, his voice low but urgent. "Meg, you have to tell me what's happening. You're shaking." She opened her mouth to deny it, to create another excuse, but before she could speak, a crew member nearly collided with them, shouting into a headset about a model who had fainted, and Harry pulled Meghan aside so they weren't trampled, the chaos swirling around them like a storm. Meghan inhaled deeply, eyes fluttering closed for a moment, trying to ground herself, but flashes of the past kept breaking through. Marcus whispering in dim hotel bars, exchanging favors with her when she was desperate to climb out of obscurity, when she still believed shortcuts didn't have consequences, when she trusted the wrong people and made promises she never intended to keep. Those old mistakes now hovered over her like smoke she couldn't escape, and Harry, sensing her drifting panic, placed both hands on her shoulders and whispered, "Whatever this is, we can fix it together." And she almost believed him, almost told him everything. Almost, but she swallowed it back, forcing a smile that didn't touch her eyes, whispering, "I'm just overwhelmed. It's loud. It's crowded. It's nothing, Harry. Truly." But when she tried to walk away, Harry didn't move, didn't allow her to pass, his eyes suddenly harder, sharper, filled with a determination she rarely saw, and he murmured, "It's not nothing. And I'm not stupid, Meg." His words stopped her mid-step, her breath hitching painfully, but before she could argue, a sudden crash erupted behind them, something heavy hitting the floor, and both of them turned just in time to see a metal lighting rig tipping dangerously near the side curtains, people screaming, models scattering as the massive structure swung downward, and Harry instinctively grabbed Meghan and yanked her back with a force that knocked the air from her lungs, pulling her behind a rack of gowns as the rig slammed into the ground exactly where she had been standing seconds before. The sound was deafening, metal screeching against metal, sparks flicking off the floor, and Meghan stared at the wreckage, heart hammering against her ribs so violently she could barely breathe. Crew members rushed forward, shouting, checking for injuries, and someone yelled about faulty cables. But Meghan's eyes scanned the crowd with increasing dread because accidents happened. Yes, but this didn't feel like an accident. This felt like a warning. Harry was breathless, gripping her arms tightly as he checked her for injuries, murmuring, "Are you okay? Meg, look at me. Are you hurt?" But Meghan couldn't answer. Her eyes were trained on a figure at the far end of the hallway, Marcus, standing completely still, hands in his pockets, expression calm. Too calm, as everyone else panicked. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He only watched her, and when their eyes met, he tilted his head ever so slightly, as if acknowledging her unspoken suspicion. A chill slid down her spine so sharply she shivered, and Harry, noticing her focus shift, turned in the direction she was staring, but Marcus had already disappeared into the shadows. Harry asked, "Meg, what are you looking at?" And Meghan blinked, shaking her head quickly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. Nothing, just nothing. But Harry didn't believe her. She could feel it in the silence that followed, heavy and tense. Before he could question her again, a producer rushed toward them, face flushed, voice frantic. "Meghan, we need you backstage for the final rehearsal walk. You're a VIP guest. They want you positioned near the front. Please, we're behind schedule." Harry still looked like he wanted to drag her somewhere private and force the truth out of her, but Meghan grabbed his hand, smiled the most convincing smile she could muster, and said, "Come with me. Please. I don't want to be alone right now." And though he hesitated, he finally nodded, allowing her to lead him through the curtains and into the central backstage corridor. The energy there had shifted. Something darker hummed beneath the surface, as though everyone sensed an undercurrent of danger but couldn't pinpoint its source. Models whispered anxiously. Assistants moved faster than normal, glancing over their shoulders as if feeling watched. Even the designers looked restless, checking their phones repeatedly. Meghan felt the unease crawling across her skin like static, and as she and Harry walked deeper into the maze of hallways, she overheard fragmented conversations. Security said someone accessed the restricted area. They said a guest list was tampered with. Someone's wristband was duplicated. They're checking the back exits, all of it swirling together into a growing storm of suspicion and fear. Meghan tightened her grip on Harry's hand. The last thing she needed was more uncertainty, more questions, more shadows. But the night wasn't done with her. When they reached the side platform near the runway, a coordinator pointed to their seats, telling them to wait until the lights dimmed, and Harry guided Meghan to a corner where she could lean against the railing. He stood close, closer than before, his body angled protectively, his voice soft but unyielding. "Meg, this isn't normal, and I know you know something." She stared down at the runway floor, the stage lights flickering in patterns that made her dizzy, and whispered, I don't want a night to become another headline. I don't want drama. I don't want rumors. I want to breathe without someone twisting it into something ugly." Harry softened slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, murmuring, "I'm not someone. I'm your husband. Talk to me." And for a moment, she almost did. She felt the confession rising in her throat, felt the weight of years pressing against her chest. But the moment shattered when the overhead lights suddenly cut, plunging backstage into darkness except for a faint emergency glow.
People gasped.
Someone screamed. Tech crew shouted instructions into radios. A loud clang echoed somewhere near the storage rooms. Pandemonium erupted instantly, and Meghan instinctively grabbed Harry's arm as the shadows thickened around them. The emergency lights flickered, and then Meghan felt it. A presence behind her. A whisper of air. A shift in the darkness. When she turned, Marcus stood just inches away, the dim red glow outlining his face like a specter emerging from a nightmare. He leaned close, speaking in a calm, deadly whisper that only she could hear over the chaos. "You can pretend all you want, Meghan, but you know I didn't come here to reminisce. I came because you owe me, and I always collect." Her entire body locked up, breath stolen from her lungs, and before she could react, Harry spun toward them, his voice sharp. "Hey, what did you just say to my wife?" But Marcus had already stepped back into the dark corridor, disappearing just as security officers rushed in with flashlights to assess the blackout. Meghan stood frozen, pulse spiraling, her world tilting dangerously as Harry demanded, "Meg,
What is going on?"
But she couldn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she finally understood. Marcus wasn't here for attention. He wasn't here for coincidence. He wasn't here for drama. He was here for payback. And the night was far from over. The blackout lasted only seconds, but to Meghan it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Just a long, suffocating silence broken only by the frantic breathing of people around her, the distant screams of staff trying to manage the chaos, and Harry's firm grip on her arm as if he feared she would vanish in the darkness as suddenly as Marcus had. And when the lights finally flickered back on in trembling pulses of white and blue, the room burst into confusion, security rushing into every corner, designers shouting about ruined cues, assistants scrambling to reassemble broken equipment, and the crowd's panic filling the air like smoke, while Meghan stood frozen against the railing, staring at the spot where Marcus had whispered those words that felt like knives carved into her ribs. Harry turned her to face him, his eyes burning, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "Meg, you have to tell me what he wants. What is he talking about? What do you owe him? Why is he threatening you?" But she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, because her mind was replaying every memory she had tried to bury. Marcus helping her when she was unknown, when she had no safety net, when she didn't know how to navigate the world she desperately wanted to rise into. Marcus covering for her when she made desperate decisions that could have destroyed her career. Marcus knowing the version of her she never wanted the world or Harry to know. Harry grabbed her hands, squeezing them, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Meghan, I love you, but I can't protect you from ghosts I can't see." His voice cracked on the last word, something raw and vulnerable breaking through his frustration, and she felt a painful twist of guilt deep in her chest. But before she could answer, a piercing alarm shrieked through the corridor, sending another wave of panic through the backstage area. Security shouted for everyone to clear the hallway, moving people toward the side exits, and a voice on the radio yelled that someone had accessed the restricted backstage control room, which only heightened the rising terror. Harry pulled Meghan with him, shielding her as bodies pushed past them, but Meghan tugged back suddenly, her voice barely a breath. "Harry, he's not going to stop." Harry turned toward her, confusion tightening his features, but she didn't explain. She couldn't, not yet, because she saw something over his shoulder, a fleeting shadow slipping through a narrow service door behind the stage, a door marked staff only, barely visible under the flickering emergency lights, and everything in her recoiled at the realization that Marcus was moving through the building like he owned it, like he knew every route, every blind corner, every place security wouldn't check. Fast enough. Harry followed her gaze, and without hesitation he muttered, "Stay behind me," before pushing through the crowd toward the hidden doorway. Meghan's heart hammered painfully as she followed, her heels clicking rapidly against the concrete floor, the noise from the main venue muffling behind them as they slipped into the narrow passage that smelled of dust, electrical wiring, and old metal. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb, and the hum of generators echoed toward them like a distant growl. Harry moved carefully, scanning each side path, each shadow, his shoulders tense, his steps eerily quiet against the linoleum floor, while Meghan tried to control her breathing, choking back the fear swelling inside her. They reached a dead-end door slightly ajar, a thin strip of bluish light spilling on. Inside was the show's internal control room, screens everywhere, wires snaking across the floor, several technicians panicking as they tried to restore the lighting cues, barking into phones, typing frantically, but one thing stood out immediately: a broken lock hanging from the electrical cabinet near the back. A technician noticed Harry and Meghan enter and rushed forward, breathless. Someone forced their way in here. Someone messed with the main switchboard. We're trying to repair the damage before the finale begins, but this wasn't an accident. Someone wanted the blackout. Harry and Meghan exchanged a look, heavy, knowing, terrified, to the floor, and Harry pushed it open slowly.